In psychology, sociology, and anthropology, identity is the conception, qualities, beliefs, and expressions that make a person or group different from others. Description. One may define identity as the distinctive characteristic belonging to any given individual, or shared by all members of a particular social category or group. Identity may be distinguished from identification. Identity is a label, whereas identification refers to the classifying act itself. Identity is thus best construed as being both relational and contextual, while the act of identification is best viewed as inherently processual. However, the formation of one's identity occurs through one's identifications with significant others. These others may be benign, such that one aspires to their characteristics, values and beliefs, or malign, when one wishes to dissociate from their characteristics. A psychological identity relates to self-image, self-esteem, and individuality. Consequently, Weinreich gives the definition: a person's identity is defined as the totality of one's self-construal, in which how one construes oneself in the present expresses the continuity between how one construes oneself as one was in the past and how one construes oneself as one aspires to be in the future. This allows for definitions of aspects of identity, such as one's ethnic identity is defined as that part of the totality of one's self-construal made up of those dimensions that express the continuity between one's construal of past ancestry and one's future aspirations in relation to ethnicity. Gender identity forms an important part of identity in psychology, as it dictates to a significant degree how one views oneself both as a person and in relation to other people, ideas and nature. Other aspects of identity, such as racial, religious, ethnic, occupational, etc., may also be more or less significant, or significant in some situations but not in others. In cognitive psychology, the term identity refers to the capacity for self-reflection and the awareness of self. The inclusiveness of Weinreich's definition directs attention to the totality of one's identity at a given phase in time, depending on whether one is a young child or an adult at the height of one's powers. How one construes oneself as one was in the past will refer to very different salient experiential markers. Likewise, how one construes oneself as one aspires to be in the future will differ considerably according to one's age and accumulated experiences. 2003, pp. 26-34. Sociology places some explanatory weight on the concept of role behavior. The notion of identity negotiation may arise from the learning of social roles through personal experience. Identity negotiation is a process in which a person negotiates with society at large regarding the meaning of his or her identity. Psychologists most commonly use the term identity to describe personal identity, or the idiosyncratic things that make a person unique. Meanwhile, sociologists often use the term to describe social identity, or the collection of group memberships that define the individual. However, these uses are not proprietary, and each discipline may use either concept, and each discipline may combine both concepts when considering a person's identity. The description or representation of individual and group identity is a central task for psychologists, sociologists and anthropologists, and those of other disciplines where identity needs to be mapped and defined. How should one describe the identity of another? In ways which encompass both their idiosyncratic qualities and their group memberships or identifications, both of which can shift according to circumstance. Following on from the work of Kelly, Erickson, Tajfel and others, Weinreich's identity structure analysis is a structural representation of the individual's existential experience, in which the relationships between self and other agents are organized in relatively stable structures over time, with the emphasis on the socio-cultural milieu in which self relates to other agents and institutions. 2003. p. 1. Using constructs drawn from the salient discourses of the individual, the group and cultural norms. The practical operationalization of ISA provides a methodology that maps how these are used by the individual, applied across time and milieus by the situated self, to appraise self and other agents and institutions. In psychology, Erik Erikson became one of the earliest psychologists to take an explicit interest in identity. The Ericksonian framework rests upon a distinction among the psychological sense of continuity, known as the ego identity, the personal idiosyncrasies that separate one person from the next, known as the personal identity, and the collection of social roles that a person might play, known as either the social identity or the cultural identity. Erickson's work, in the psychodynamic tradition, aimed to investigate the process of identity formation across a lifespan. Progressive strength in the ego identity, for example, can be charted in terms of a series of stages in which identity is formed in response to increasingly sophisticated challenges. The process of forming a viable sense of identity for the culture is conceptualized as an adolescent task, and those who do not manage a resynthesis of childhood identifications are seen as being in a state of identity diffusion, whereas those who retain their initially given identities unquestioned have foreclosed identities. On some readings of Erickson, the development of a strong ego identity, along with the proper integration into a stable society and culture, lead to a stronger sense of identity in general. Accordingly, a deficiency in either of these factors may increase the chance of an identity crisis or confusion. Although the self is distinct from identity, the literature of self-psychology can offer some insight into how identity is maintained. From the vantage point of self-psychology, there are two areas of interest: the processes by which a self is formed, and the actual content of the schemata which compose the self-concept. In the latter field, theorists have shown interest in relating the self-concept to self-esteem, the differences between complex and simple ways of organizing self-knowledge, and the links between those organizing principles and the processing of information. The neo-Ericksonian identity status paradigm emerged in later years, driven largely by the work of James Marcia. This paradigm focuses upon the twin concepts of exploration and commitment. The central idea is that any individual's sense of identity is determined in large part by the explorations and commitments that he or she makes regarding certain personal and social traits. It follows that the core of the research in this paradigm investigates the degrees to which a person has made certain explorations, and the degree to which he or she displays a commitment to those explorations. A person may display either relative weakness or relative strength in terms of both exploration and commitments. When assigned categories, four possible permutations result: identity diffusion, identity foreclosure, identity moratorium, and identity achievement. Diffusion is when a person lacks both exploration in life and interest in committing even to those unchosen roles that he or she occupies. Foreclosure is when a person has not chosen extensively in the past, but seems willing to commit to some relevant values, goals, or roles in the future. Moratorium is when a person displays a kind of flightiness, ready to make choices but unable to commit to them. Finally, achievement is when a person makes identity choices and commits to them. Here, with respect to identity diffusion for example, an optimal level is interpreted as the norm, as it is unrealistic to expect an individual to resolve all their conflicted identifications with others. Therefore we should be alert to individuals with levels which are much higher or lower than the norm. Highly diffused individuals are classified as diffused, and those with low levels as foreclosed or defensive. Weinreich applies the identity variant in a framework which also allows for the transition from one to another by way of biographical experiences, and resolution of conflicted identifications situated in various contexts. For example, an adolescent going through family breakup may be in one state, whereas later in a stable marriage with a secure professional role may be in another. Hence, though there is continuity, there is also development and change. Lane's definition of identity closely follows Erickson's, in emphasizing the past, present and future components of the experienced self. He also develops the concept of the meta-perspective of self, i.e., the self's perception of the other's view of self, which has been found to be extremely important in clinical contexts such as anorexia nervosa. Harry also conceptualizes components of self, identity, the person, along with aspects of self, and the personal characteristics displayed to others. In social psychology, at a general level, self-psychology is compelled to investigate the question of how the personal self relates to the social environment. To the extent that these theories place themselves in the tradition of psychological, social psychology, they focus on explaining an individual's actions within a group in terms of mental events and states. However, some sociological, social psychology theories go further by attempting to deal with the issue of identity at both the levels of individual cognition and of collective behavior. Collective identity. Many people gain a sense of positive self-esteem from their identity groups, which furthers a sense of community and belonging. Another issue that researchers have attempted to address is the question of why people engage in discrimination, i.e., why they tend to favor those they consider a part of their in-group over those considered to be outsiders. Both questions have been given extensive attention by researchers working in the social identity tradition. For example, in work relating to social identity theory, it has been shown that merely crafting cognitive distinction between in and out groups can lead to subtle effects on people's evaluations of others. Different social situations also compel people to attach themselves to different self-identities, which may cause some to feel marginalized, thus traveling between different groups and self-identifications. These different selves lead to constructed images dichotomized between what people want to be and how others see them. Educational background and occupational status and roles significantly influence identity formation in this regard. Identity formation strategies. Another issue of interest in social psychology is related to the notion that there are certain identity formation strategies which a person may use to adapt to the social world. Developed a typology which investigated the different manners of behavior that individuals may have. Their typology includes. Kenneth Gurdjieff formulated additional classifications, which include the strategic manipulator, the pastiche personality, and the relational self. The strategic manipulator is a person who begins to regard all senses of identity merely as role-playing exercises, and who gradually becomes alienated from his or her social self. The pastiche personality abandons all aspirations toward a true or essential identity, instead viewing social interactions as opportunities to play out, and hence become the roles they play. Finally, the relational self is a perspective by which persons abandon all sense of exclusive self, and view all sense of identity in terms of social engagement with others. For Gurdjieff, these strategies follow one another in phases, and they are linked to the increase in popularity of postmodern culture and the rise of telecommunications technology.